My name is Nikolai, and I am a postdoctoral scholar at the Rock Ethics Institute here at Penn State University. So I welcome you all as part of our Rock Research Ethics Lecture Series this year, and none of this would have been possible with the generous support of Doug and Julie Rock, and we really thank them for their ongoing support for the Rock. And also, none of this would have been possible without the help of my colleague Jonathan and Rob Peeler, Deborah Trollnas, and Caroline Umbrecht for their help in setting up the room and with all the other details. It is my real pleasure to welcome to our series Dr. Jonathan Marks. Dr. Marks is an associate professor of bioethics, humanities, and law here at Penn State University, as well as a barrister and an academic member of the legal firm Matrix Chambers out of London. And I've been told London, UK, not London, Ontario. He received his education and training from Oxford University and was recently a SAFRA faculty fellow in ethics at Harvard University. Professor Mark has published widely in both academic and public forums on counterterrorism, human rights law, bioethics, and public health. His recent research focus is on ethical issues related to relationships between industry and academia. This evening, we're pleased to host Professor Marks for a talk entitled "When We Dance," mapping the systemic ethical implication of the research university's relationship with industry. Professor Marks will share about 45 to 50 minutes of comments. Then we'll have a short period of questions and conversation at the end. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jonathan Marks.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Nikolai. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening and to be talking to a happily packed room. I'm going to talk to you about a subject that I feel very strongly about, I'm very passionate about, and for those of you in the room who are embarking on your careers, I urge you to work on those things you are passionate about, because those are the things you will pursue with the greatest vigor and the greatest interest, and they will be the ones that will truly reward you. This also, I think, happens to be a topic which is not just a passion of mine, but of considerable importance in my view. And so the title of my talk is "When We Dance, Mapping the Systemic Ethical Implications of Industry-Academy Relations." So those of you who are here to learn about dancing, you're definitely in the wrong lecture. I'm grateful to the Rock Ethics Institute for its support, as well as to the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard, where I am currently a network fellow. To my colleague Don Thompson here, who is a great interlocutor, two colleagues also affiliated with Safra, Lisa Cosgrove and Susanna Rose. Last year we had, and actually for a little bit before that, we had Chris Mays, a postdoc from Australia, and now we are truly blessed and privileged to have Brian Swick, Nikolai Morar, and Jonathan Beaver with us today. And actually, although not on the list, I should say that Jess Ballinger has been, for all my time here, a wonderful interlocutor on this topic and many others. So, let me say something about the title. I didn't come up with the metaphor of dancing to describe the relationship between the academy and industry. My colleague Françoise Baylis and some of her authors wrote in a piece in 2001, "Some bargains are Faustian and some horses are Trojan. Dance carefully with the porcupine and know in advance the price of intimacy." And by the porcupine, they meant industry. And intimacy, actually, I will perhaps expand on Q&A if not here, is an interesting choice of word. I think reciprocity is one of the issues here. But I'll say more about that later. Arthur Schaefer wrote in the Journal of Medical Ethics in 2004, I should say this was a symposium issue of the Journal of Medical Ethics, which was devoted to a case which was the case that transformed my career from a legal case into from a legal career into an ethical one, or the pursuit of ethical interests. The case of a Canadian physician, Dr. Nancy Olivieri, whose work was funded by a pharmaceutical company, When she became concerned that the drug was of declining efficacy and increasing toxicity over time, she wanted to reconsent the patients in the clinical trial. The drug company left her a threatening message in her answer machine saying, if you tell anyone about this, we will sue you for breach of confidentiality. And so they tried to interfere with her ethical obligation to the participants of the drug trial. And that led to a whole spate of litigation, some of which I was involved in as her counsel. But I started to take the view that what was most interesting about the case were not the legal issues, but indeed the ethical ones. And that's how I embarked on my career as a bioethicist. So for the younger people in the room, that just goes to show you that sometimes you have no idea where you're going, or you think you know where you're going, and then something transforms your career plans entirely. That, for me, was the Olivieri case. And in this special symposium issue, Arthur Schaeffer, a Canadian philosopher, wrote, there are some dances which it might be better to sit out if one values one's integrity. And by dances, again, he's talking about the relationship with industry for academic researchers. And again, I'll come back in a moment and explore what integrity means. And I don't know what that noise was. A more recent article in Science put it this way: industry-academic collaborations are like partners skilled in different dances, trying to reach a compromise between waltz and salsa. Don't ask me who's who. Rhythms, pace, and expected outcomes can be frustratingly at odds as university researchers prioritize education and basic research, and corporate scientists pursue products and profits. Now, again, you might take issue with the second sentence in the characterization, but you can see from the title of the article, it's an exploration perhaps more charitably disposed to partnerships than the previous two. So all these quotations may conjure in your mind this image. And what I want to urge you to do is not to think of industry-academy relations as this, but more like this. So there's lots of dancing going involved, lots of partners. In fact, one can't really find an academic institution these days without a complex web of relationships with industry. And various explanations are given for this, including declining public funds for research, among others. So what has evolved over the last few years are a whole complex web of industry-academy interactions. Now, people often think of industry-sponsored research as the paradigm case of the interaction between industry and the academy. In other words, researchers not having public funds for their research go to industry, or alternatively, industry offers money to the academy in order to sponsor research. Now, that's true. That's a significant part of the relationship between industry and the academy, but it's not the whole story. And although it's going to be a lot of what I'm talking about, I think it's important to note that there are all sorts of other kinds of relationships. Some are described as unrestricted gifts from industry to the academy, so it's not specified what purpose those gifts should be applied for. Others are infrastructure gifts, gifts for buildings, labs, rooms, endowed colleges, departments, institutes, chairs, career awards, student prizes. Now, these two are, I think, important because they're indicia of reputation, right? These are gifts which are tied with academic achievement, and so they become markers of academic reputation. In addition to student fellowships and assistantships, there are also partnerships, and I put them in inverted commas because partnerships describes a wide variety of relationships. It would be remiss of me, I think, not to talk about our own institution because we're here. And so I'm just going to flag, and this is not to suggest we're the only institution in this category, but Penn State has every year something it calls their 2013 this year corporate partner. And these are the parties designated as corporate partners every year are so designated because of their, quote, extraordinary generosity in the promotion and support of Penn State University. And in order to assess this, they look at, quote, the consistency of giving the support to areas of greatest need and impact across Penn State University. This year, the corporate partner is GE, General Electric. Last year, it was Chevron. In other years, it's been Highmark, who, as you know, administer the health insurance plan at Penn State. So this is just an example, some local examples of so-called partnerships. And indeed, I gave a seminar discussing public-private partnerships at some length earlier on today. There are also other kinds of reciprocal arrangements that can arise between industry and the academy, including giving formally or informally preferred status to the graduates of one institution, sort of grooming them for jobs and the like. So there are a very complex web of, and indeed many categories of relationship, and this is not meant to be exhaustive, just a set of examples to show you that it's more than just industry-sponsored research. But as I say, that's going to be the focus of much of what I will say. So I'm not the first, of course, to flag concerns about the question of academy-industry relations, and in particular of industry-sponsored research. But much of the literature that addresses this topic has focused on individual relationships, individual researchers and industry, focusing on financial conflicts of interest. So for often raising concerns that a particular PI in a study also is a consultant for the company whose products are the subject of the research, or has some other relationship which might give rise to a conflict of interest. And one can embark on a great debate about what we mean about conflict of interest. I'm just going to put that to one side for the moment, because I'm going to give you a different framework for looking at these questions. But essentially, much of the literature looks at individual researchers in isolation and their relationships with industry. The literature also tends to focus on what are called, what has been called by Sheldon Krimsky and others, the funding effect. This is the idea that there's a correlation between industry sponsorship of research and the findings, the outcomes of that research. So for example, in the medical research arena, there have been a number of meta-analyses conducted which suggest that industry-sponsored drug trials, trials of pharmaceuticals, are, depending whose study you read, 4 to 20 times more likely to produce favorable outcomes in relation to the drug being tested than independent research, i.e. research not funded by industry, conducted by researchers without any financial relationships with industry or other apparent financial conflict of interest. These approaches, this literature is important, but in my view it neglects some broader systemic issues, and it tends to result in proposals that are very limited in their scope in terms of addressing this problem. So for example, one panacea, or what's often presented as a panacea, is disclosure. If you have a financial relationship with industry, just disclose it. Now, I'm not going to argue against disclosure. Obviously, one would want to know if there was a financial conflict of interest. Indeed, one of my colleagues who just recently graduated from Harvard Medical School was part of a cadre of young and energetic medical students who said, we get lectures every day from professors about drugs, and we have no idea whether they take money from drug companies, do consultancy for companies, have industry-funded studies by those companies. And as a result, now, every time a professor stands up in Harvard Medical School and conducts a lecture, their second slide is one of the following. I have no conflicts of interest. I have conflicts of interest, but they're not relevant to this presentation. Or I have conflicts of interest, they are relevant to this presentation, and here's what they are. So disclosure of conflicts of interest is important, but it's also important to recognize that it's not a solution to the problem. And there are a couple of sort of perverse effects of disclosure of conflicts of interest some of the literature has revealed. One is that once I tell you I have a relationship with industry, I feel liberated. Now I can gild the lily and say what I like because I've come clean and said I have a relationship with industry. I've forewarned you. So that's the first sort of perverse effect. And the second is that it's not clear that people reading your disclosure of the conflict of interest know what to do about it. So in the run-up to the Affordable Care Act, a topic much in the news, In the run-up to the Affordable Care Act, when it was still a bill, there was a great deal of discussion about what Americans wanted. And there was a piece published, as I recall, in the New England Journal of Medicine that sought to pull together a variety of empirical studies that explored whether Americans wanted a single-payer health system. Now, that study was co-authored by two people, each of whom had a relationship with an HMO, either a health maintenance organization, that's the acronym we use for health insurance companies. Each of the two authors had a relationship with an HMO, either a current or former office or a shareholding. That was disclosed. I had been following the healthcare debate very closely. I had no idea what to do now that I had read the disclosures. Should I distrust the article entirely? Should I check every citation, every footnote, and see if every article they cited had been faithfully reproduced? I had no idea what to do. And that's somebody who had been thinking a great deal about this issue. So often, the disclosures are problematic for just those reasons. But even if you take disclosures at their face value, in my view, they are far too narrow, and they don't address the really broad questions about the relationship between industry and the academy and some of its effects. Now, again, I'm not the first to allude to these concerns. There was an article in the British Medical Journal in 2002, and I should say the former editor of that journal has written a very eloquent treatise critiquing industry relationships with journals and medical institutions. And in this article, in the BMJ, the authors talk about the impact of industry-academy relations on the quality of research, research outcomes, the dissemination of research, and in addition, emphasize concerns about public trust in science and research institutions. Now, I should say, just because these authors flag quality of research, it's not entirely clear why it is that industry-funded studies often produce more favorable outcomes. Some people have argued and conducted some empirical work to try and show that when you have industry-funded studies, there's poorer quality methodology and a higher risk of bias, but other people have pointed to work the other way, and so there isn't a clear mechanism right now for the impact on research outcomes. But anyway, you can see here that people are concerned both about the quality of research and its dissemination, and indeed the impact on public trust in researchers and research institutions, and I'm going to say more about that. But what I want to do is really stand back now and frame this in terms of some very, very broad systemic concerns. So as we in the academy become more interwoven with industry, as indeed, I will add to this, government becomes so closely interwoven in its relationships with industry, we start to see, we are seeing in areas that I will try and identify, what I call framing effects, a shift in the way we start to understand social problems. And I like to use here the language of Frank Fisher. He uses the term wicked problems, society's wicked problems. These are problems so challenging we struggle to define them, let alone solve them. So you might say an example, a contemporary example of one of those problems is obesity, right? And what you find is, increasingly, a description of that problem as one of individual responsibility and consumer choice, right? If only we can get people to eat better, behave better, exercise better, right, we can solve obesity. Now, I am not saying that individual behavior is irrelevant. What I am arguing is that that framing, that focus, that emphasis on individual behavior is one which happens to be incredibly consonant with, consistent with, not threatening to the interests of a large number of industry actors. Big food companies, for example. Companies that manufacture soft drinks that are high in sugar or high fructose corn syrup. Doesn't matter what kind of sugar, just high in sugar. Or fast food companies or other companies manufacturing products that public health experts argue contribute to obesity. So in other words, those companies are part of a large set of systemic and environmental factors that contribute to obesity. But what we see a lot of is framing in terms of how can we get people to eat better, rather than how can we structure or restructure systemic and environmental factors such as our food system in order to address that problem. So that's the first example of a framing effect. Another systemic concern is a technological bias. And another way of thinking about this is to say that it leads us to formulate and to work on the kinds of solutions to these social or wicked problems that are technological and readily commercializable. So if we go back to the obesity example, in my view, an instantiation of this is the idea of a satiety supplement, which you may have seen advertisements for on television. This is the powder that you can sprinkle on your Big Mac and fries so that you feel more satiated, you feel full after you've had your Big Mac, right? That happens to be a nice solution because it's a product which can be sold and marketed and is sold and marketed. So it just makes more money for somebody else. Other examples are, and I'm going to talk about this maybe in a little more detail, bacteria for regularity, Activia yogurt. So if you find yourself constipated, just eat more yogurt rather than thinking about, all the other things in your diet that might be contributing to that. The third sort of systemic concern is funding priorities. So if there is industry money to look at X, that's where we look. And this doesn't just affect research institution funding priorities, it affects government funding priorities. Because the government wants to get more bang for its buck. The NIH has awarded a Clinical and Translational Science Award to this institution, Penn State, and 59 others across the United States. In order to get one of those awards, you have to demonstrate a willingness and an ability to collaborate with industry. It's part of the package. So what you start to see is that industry funding priorities affect government funding priorities and the research priorities of individual research institutions. And this, in my view, leads to something you might call research agenda distortion. And when I say research agenda distortion, I don't need to have in mind some perfect notion of what the research environment would look like. There is no such thing, right? Research is a socially constructed enterprise like many other things we do. But what I am arguing is that there are many ways in which one can say, I think, with some degree of confidence, that entire areas of research have been distorted or shaped or redirected in ways that advance the interests of industry. We had a speaker here in our food ethics lecture series who pointed out that this was nothing novel and that you could point to entomology departments across the US in the 1970s who weren't doing research into insects. They were basically devoting their energies to developing pesticides because that is where the money was. So this is not new. But as I'm going to show in a minute, I think in one example, in the case of nutrition, we have a whole host of research institutions and researchers who are doing work on what you might call one-sided benefits research, something Don and I have talked about and written a little bit about too. So I'll say a little bit more about that. But my general point is this, that if we are trying to solve these wicked problems, these social problems, we need to be looking in lots of different places. And my concern is that the lights are all shining in the same place. The place where it's in the interest of industry to find the answer. It's like only looking for your keys where somebody wants you to look, right? That's not very helpful if you've dropped them somewhere else. So that's essentially my concern, and I'm going to illustrate it with some examples. So first, from the food and nutrition world. anyone who has been in a supermarket recently will not be surprised to learn from this 2010 survey conducted by some at the US Department of Agriculture. Half of all supermarket products they found in a survey of supermarkets in North Dakota used nutrition-based marketing, right? These foods were being sold, promoted for their nutrition benefits. They also pointed out, troublingly, that roughly half of those products were high in saturated fat, sodium, or sugar. And if they looked at products aimed at children, just shy of 60% were high in saturated fat, sodium, or sugar. So what this tells you, this study suggests at least, is that not only is there a huge amount of food in our supermarkets being promoted for its purported health and nutrition benefits, but a lot of those foods are problematic for other reasons. If you're concerned about caloric intake, you're obviously concerned about the sugar content, et cetera, et cetera. So we know that this is how food is being sold to us, and my colleague Don Thompson has taken many photographs to demonstrate this, everything from a variety of different kinds of milk to Dan Active, which was a Dannon yogurt drink, which was marketed for its immunity benefits. I used to joke, does that mean immunity from prosecution, or what exactly does that mean? Helps strengthen your body's defenses. There was a television commercial which went along with this, and it showed you a child who was so depleted of energy, the color drained out of him. And then he drank his Dan Active, and he was restored to full color with, I should add, a full body halo on top. And you know, that's just an example. There are many others. There's a margarine here called Promise, which says cardiologist endorsed, and my immediate response is, who is that cardiologist, right? Then there are 2 jars of nuts. It's hard to tell what the difference is, but one is energy mix and the other is heart healthy. The popcorn, the largest words on that packet are smart balance. I don't think you can actually see the word popcorn. And Raisinets, of course, which have 30% less fat than some other chocolate brand, although not quite clear what. And of course have fruit antioxidants. Whether people think that stops them from rusting or something else is also unclear. This is an advertisement Jamie Lee Curtis did for Activia yogurt, the one said to promote regularity. There's a great spoof of that on Saturday Night Live, which I won't show you, but it's very funny. It has her running to the bathroom repeatedly during the making of the commercial. What's interesting is Dannon did fund some research to demonstrate the regularity benefits of consuming that yogurt. But the evidence they had suggested, at the very least, you'd have to have 3 pots of yogurt a day in order to get that health benefit. Now, I love yogurt, but I have never in my life had 3 pots of yogurt a day. And if I did, I would just have added 450 calories to my diet. So now I have to either exercise it off, substitute it out for other food, or weight gain results. What are the chronic adverse effects of consuming 3 pots of yogurt a day for the regularity benefits? We don't know, because there's no structural incentive to do that research. It's not in their interest to find out. There's a lot of industry-sponsored research. Efforts in the nutrition sphere, efforts to quantify it have not been entirely successful. We don't know quite how much it is, but it's clearly substantial. And much of that research has been done not to meet regulatory requirements for reasons I can explain in the Q&A, but indeed to seed articles in newspapers, magazines, and elsewhere to promote foods as healthy. And consistent with what I've said before, there are some studies which have raised concerns about conflicts of interest and favorable outcomes in relation to nutrition research. For example, this piece in 2007 by Lesser and others. But I think the problem is more substantial than that. So I think a whole field has been shaped in a way which is very supportive of industry interests. So the Institute of Medicine has defined functional foods as any food or ingredient that may provide a health benefit beyond the traditional nutrients it contains, right? So, I would argue if you're going to make a claim that a food is bioactive, that it has an effect on the body above and beyond basic nutrition, then it can be bioactively helpful or harmful. And yet what you have here is the whole field defined in terms of benefit, right? If it has a role and a function of the human body, that role could be beneficial or harmful. And indeed, if you start to look at the journals that have emerged, here's the Journal of Functional Foods, and I'm grateful to Dawn for pointing this out to me. It aims to bring together the results of fundamental and applied research in functional foods, i.e. those containing various factors to ensure or enhance health, and then, moreover, their development and commercialization in food products, right? So again, you can see not a concern about the adverse effects, and again, a shift and an emphasis on commercialization. So what I would argue is if the purpose of research in nutrition is to explore the relationship between food and health, the field should explore risks, including chronic adverse effects, as well as potential benefits. And it should be interested in both in relation to the subjects that are within the field of inquiry, whether it be yogurt, pistachio oil, chocolate, or red wine, whatever it is. And as I say, but most research in the field is driven by commercial incentives. There isn't a division of the NIH which focuses on this kind of research. And so what essentially you get is research that is one-sided. It's research designed to demonstrate the health benefits of various foods. And in my view, you might call that one-sided research, and you might call that an example of research agenda distortion. Actually, before I go on to another example from a different field, when I first started looking at this issue with Dawn several years ago, there was a call for research proposals, I think it was in 2007, from the National Dairy Council, which essentially sort of is there to advance the interests of dairy agribusiness and to fund research that does so. And in their call for research proposals, it said expressly, we want studies, we want to fund studies that show the health benefits of consuming dairy. And by the time I looked again at this, 3 or 4 years later, 2010 or 11, their call had changed. Now they were asking for research proposals which were much more neutral, didn't expressly emphasize benefit. But I spoke to somebody who was in the review panel, who for obvious reasons shall remain nameless. And that person said to me, we don't need more studies demonstrating that eating lots of cheese high in saturated fat is bad for you. We know that already. So we want to see some research to show how dairy products can be good for you. Then we'd be learning something new. Now, some people would say, if given the remit of the National Dairy Council, one shouldn't expect them to fund research that does anything else than advance the interests of dairy. But again, I'll come back to that in Q&A. Let me give you some quick examples from other arenas. There was a book called Pink Ribbons, Inc., which inspired a documentary of the same name. And one of the claims made in the book and in the film is about corporate philanthropy and breast cancer research. The argument essentially is this: the vast majority of cancer research, and indeed a huge amount of corporate philanthropy, funds research into treatment. And the examples that are given in this film and in the book is with the Susan G. Komen Foundation, which trademarked itself actually at one point as Susan G. Komen for the Cure. And the criticism was, the foundation has no interest in funding research to explore the causes of breast cancer and prevention, because that would be inimical to the interests of their corporate sponsors, their corporate donors. After all, I think as somebody said in the documentary, if you are a major makeup company, you don't want to be told that you have carcinogens in your makeup. Or you certainly don't want that broadcast loudly. Now, I've had to and fro with many people about this. Since the film was made, the Susan G. Komen Foundation has dropped the Susan G. Komen for the Cure. And they have established, I think, $1 million fund for prevention research. But if you know how much, the many, many hundreds of millions of dollars they have invested in treatment research, right, that's a drop in the ocean by comparison. But one argument is, is this why, it's a legitimate question to ask, is the reason why we don't have nearly so much research on causes and prevention because it's inimical to certain interests? We live in a healthcare system. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Escape Fire. It's a movie about the healthcare system which is shown actually in many places, including the State Theatre in town here, in which the argument was made from a financial point of view. The actors in the health industry have a vested interest in us not being healthy and not dying, but just being sick, right? Because everyone benefits. Our gross domestic product increases as a result. Every time there's a payout from an HMO to a medical provider, that's taken care of in the gross domestic product. So that's part of a much, much larger argument. But a really important question is to ask, is this why we don't have more research on treatment and on causes and prevention? Similar arguments have been made elsewhere. My colleague Lisa Cosgrove is at UMass and is also a fellow at SAFRA, has written a recent paper with some of her colleagues in which she argues that financial conflicts of interest may function subtly but powerfully to shift the direction of research. She's talking about mental health research, focusing on interventions that are the most commercially attractive, but that do not necessarily represent the best science. When the NIH decreased funding of clinical trials for new drugs, turning new drug development over to industry, many clinically important trials were simply not done. And I wish I had her here because she's an expert in this area and she could elaborate much further. But I'm just flagging this as another potential area. And then to return to our own institution, this was a press release put out by Penn State that appeared in March of this year, announcing the launch of a new natural gas center, which the press release says, without any fear, is designed to keep Pennsylvania at the forefront of industry. And what's interesting is it acknowledges gifts from industry, but then says that the Institute for Natural Gas Research will be overseen by an external advisory board consisting of experts from academy, government, and industry who will help guide the Institute research toward topics that provide maximum benefit to companies. So this is a bit like the one-sided nutrition research. It's research, but research that is going to be beneficial to industry. And there's more to say about that, but I will come back and say what it is in a moment. So one way to think about this, instead of using the framework of conflicts of interest, is to use the framework that I and some of my colleagues at Harvard have been thinking about in the lab on institutional corruption. And when they talk about corruption, they don't mean sort of Rod Blagojevich running off with the money in a brown paper bag. They're talking about something else, and I'll tell you what I think is meant by the term. So I think, and I am concerned about, widespread or systemic practices that undermine the integrity or trustworthiness of an institution. And for institution, you can think about academic research center, in this case, a land-grant university, for example, and or trust and confidence in that institution, right? The integrity or trustworthiness of an institution and or trust and confidence in that institution. And there's a whole separate debate about whether it makes sense to talk about trust in institutions. I'll leave that aside. If you want to raise it in Q&A, I'm happy to say more then. But what I want to emphasize here is that there's a difference between trustworthiness and integrity on the one hand and trust and confidence on the other. Trustworthiness and integrity are properties inherent in institutions. They are attributes of institutions. Trust and confidence are attitudes towards institutions. So for example, every year somebody does a survey where they ask people, do you have trust and confidence in Congress? And the answer is 12, somewhere between 9, 10, 11, 12% say, yes, we have trust, confidence, faith, whatever other language they use in the survey, in Congress. That is an attitude toward Congress, right? But there is a separate and important question. Are these institutions trustworthy? And by that, you might want to say more specifically, who can trust them to do what in what circumstances? But another concept, and this is the one I want to focus on, is the notion of integrity. What does it mean to talk about an institution having integrity? Now, there's a great deal of literature on individual integrity, and much of that literature talks about, not exclusively about, but part of the discussion is about whether or not one's practices are consistent with one's statements, values, commitments, beliefs, etc. I don't want to talk about individual integrity, though. I want to talk about institutional integrity. And institutional integrity, I'm going to define in just a moment. But just before I do, I want to say one thing. The reason why this division in this previous slide is important is because if you focus on restoring trust and confidence in an institution that isn't trustworthy or lacks integrity, you're simply dressing up a problematic institution. So that's why the distinction between trust and confidence and what appears above the line is important. If an institution is problematic, you don't want to make people trust a problematic institution. But what is integrity for an institution? Well, I would say a prima facie way to think about the integrity of an institution is to look at what the mission or purpose of an institution is, what the institution says it does, and what the institution actually does, its practices. And if, it seems to me this is the strongest case, if the practices of an institution predictably undermine the very goals in terms of which that institution justifies its existence, that looks like a strong case for a lack of integrity. So if the institution says, we want to do X, but it's doing a whole lot of other things which don't do X and arguably undermine X, then you have a problem. So keep that idea in your head for a moment. Now, clearly, integrity has some problematic cases for institutions, because sometimes institutions have inherently conflicting missions. And I'm going to give you an example in a moment of an institution with an inherently conflicting mission. Sometimes you have an institution in transition. Penn State is a land-grant institution, a land-grant university. What does that mean? And has that meaning transformed over time? And if so, how? And what does that mean, bearing in mind that we are established by statute as a land-grant institution? That I will say more about in Q&A if people are interested. But in each of these cases where you have an institution with an inherently conflicting mission or an institution in transition, there are going to be trust concerns. Let me give you an example, as I promised. The United States Department of Agriculture. If you look at its strategic plan, it says the USDA is committed to expanding markets for agricultural products. But it's also committed to improving nutrition and health by providing nutrition, education, and promotion. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that expanding markets for agricultural products may not always be consistent with enhancing nutrition, right? Nutrition, education, and promotion. I'm going to give you an example. In November of 2010, while I was at the American Dietetic Association's annual meeting in Boston, at a session entitled "Saturated Fat, Is Everything We Thought We Really Knew True?" So it was questioning whether saturated fat is that bad or not. This story appeared in the New York Times. This was a story about something which had been under the table until the story was published. The United States Department of Agriculture had signed off on a number of arrangements between Dairy Management Incorporated, a company created by federal statute to advance the interests of dairy, and a number of large food companies. And I'll give you an example of two of the arrangements that the USDA signed off on. One was an arrangement with Domino's Pizza Company. The problem the USDA had and Dairy Management Incorporated had was that there was lots of cheese we were producing and Americans weren't eating. How are we going to offload that cheese? DMI went to Domino's and they said, you are doing the worst of all the national pizza chains in terms of competition. We can fix that for you. How are we going to fix that for you? Put more cheese in your pizza. Et voila, the stuffed crust cheese pizza was born. The USDA signed off on that arrangement, and it also signed off on the arrangement and boasted, the Dairy Management Incorporated boasted that its arrangement with Taco Bell resulted in the creation of a new Taco Bell menu item that had 8 times as much cheese as the average Taco Bell menu item. Hence the title, while warning about fat, US pushes cheese sales. You can see the trust and the integrity in there, or the lack thereof. Now that had real implications. These relationships have real implications for the USDA. When the USDA produced its My Plate, the icon that was a replacement for the food pyramid, a number of people were very critical of it. Why were they critical? Well, they said protein doesn't distinguish between protein from red meat, fish, nuts. Vegetables doesn't distinguish between potatoes and other kinds of vegetables. Grains doesn't distinguish between refined and unrefined grains. And that little blue glass there that looks like water says dairy. What's striking about each of these criticisms is that they point out a distinction or lack thereof which happens to serve the interests of a powerful sector of agribusiness. Now, Walter Willett, who's the chair of the Department of Nutrition at Harvard, said this is what you get when you mix science with powerful agricultural interests. You don't have to agree with Walter Willett to see that there's nonetheless a public trust problem here, right? So in institutions with inherently conflicting missions, trust and confidence in that institution is going to be a concern. So let's go back to the Institute for Natural Gas Research. And let's read again that final paragraph. This press release, and this appears on a couple of websites, just to be clear, it's not just that the Institute is going to do research towards topics that provide maximum benefit to companies. It's also supposed to promote scientific excellence and help educate the public on the facts of natural gas. And I ask this as a genuinely open question, and if somebody in the audience would like to answer it, I would love to hear it. How can an institute be committed to conducting research that provides maximum benefit to companies and also have credibility in educating the public on the facts of natural gas? If you have an answer to that, I would love to hear it. So trust and credibility is a real concern. And in my view, trust and credibility may be the path to at least opening the discussion about this problem in a way that benefits parties who are not yet at the table in terms of that discussion. So my colleague Susanna Rose, with Chris Robertson and Aaron Kesselheim and others, conducted a study where they created mock abstracts for articles in medical journals. And those abstracts revealed different sort of methodologic quality, and some abstracts indicated that the researchers had conflicts of interest with industry. Some reported no conflicts. And what they wanted to see was, how did the disclosure of conflicts of interest affect the physician's willingness to trust and rely on the data reported in the study? And what they concluded was, physicians discriminate among trials of varying degrees of rigor, but industry negatively influences their industry sponsorship negatively influences their perception of methodologic quality and reduces their willingness to believe and act on trial findings independently of the trial's quality. These effects may influence the translation of clinical research into practice. So in other words, Unlike the research I was alluding to before, where I said disclosure leaves the public unsure what to do, when they did their research looking at the impact of a disclosure on the relevant group of professionals, physicians reading the study, those professionals were less willing to place reliance on the studies. Now, if that is the case, there's a problem. And now there's a reason for industry and the academy to pay more attention to the problem. Because it is in neither the interests of the academy and its researchers, nor in the interests of industry to fund work that the relevant audience doesn't trust. Right? So that may be, that may grab, I think, some attention, and the study has garnered some attention. So where do we go from here? A few concluding thoughts, and then I'll be delighted to take questions. First, there have been some more ambitious proposals, at least to deal with the question of industry-funded, industry-sponsored research in the academy. In 2003, Sheldon Krimsky wrote a book called Science in the Private Interest. We had him here, thanks to Jonathan and Nikolai, to give a lecture earlier on in the semester. And the subtitle of that book, by the way, is Has the Lure of Profits Corrupted Biomedical Research? In the book, he advocates a National Institute of Drug Testing to act as a buffer zone between drug testers and stakeholders, between the researchers and the drug companies. It's an idea that was expressed independently in a separate piece just a few months later by Arthur Schaefer, to whom I referred before, in which he argued that you should sequester the industry funder from the academic researcher. They did not specify an intermediary. This idea has been around for, as you can see, a decade, but it had really no uptake. Chris Robertson tried to inject life into it in an article in the American Journal of Law and Medicine in 2011 and a symposium at Harvard from which I returned a couple of weeks ago. And he said, look, the gold standard in clinical trials of drugs is the double-blind trial, right? So that's where the physician and the patient doesn't know who's getting the drug and who's getting the placebo or the control. So let's add another layer of blinding. Let's make sure the academic researchers and the research team in their institution don't know which company is funding the research, and the company doesn't know which researchers are doing the research. And he argues that way we can maintain the subsidy function, industry subsidizing research, without industry being able to select or identify researchers. Now, in my view, it's going to be hard in some cases to create a watertight sequestration or blindness as they advocate, because if you're doing work on a patented drug or product, the patent's registered. It won't be too hard to find out what for the researcher to find out who holds the patent for the product. Similarly, if you are the company and your work relates to a very narrow, discrete area of research. So in the case of Nancy Olivieri, my former client, she was one of a handful of researchers in the world who specialized in thalassemia and could have done this research. You could identify the 2 or 3 research teams in advance and give to all of them, just as companies identify who the strongest Republican and Democrat candidates are, who have the most favorable policies, and they give X 100,000 to one and Y 100,000 to another to make sure their bets are covered. So it's not a perfect system. But even if you could make that work, I want to point out what it doesn't solve. It doesn't solve this bigger problem that I've raised called research agenda distortion. Because the money is still determining the kinds of research that gets done. So it's going to be research into this drug, which will be commercially viable for this company, this product, which will be commercially viable for that company. So research agenda distortion will not be resolved by blinding the researchers from the industry sponsors. How might we address this larger problem? I do not claim that this is an easy problem to address, but there are a number of things one could do. You could add an uplift or a surtax to any industry-sponsored research in the academy that would go into a fund to sponsor research that would counterbalance that, right? So if you find your research priorities are being distorted because this has industry money, the money that comes in from the surtax can be used to do research in what was your #1 priority. Or indeed, if you're getting money to explore whether or not Activia improves regularity, this other pocket of money goes into a pool from which you can conduct research to explore the adverse effects of consuming Activia for its regularity benefits. But what we need to talk about are other funding streams for neglected areas of research. And that means also thinking about public funding. And I know that's not easy, but I'm going to come back in a moment just before I conclude as to how we might do that. And then thirdly, we should think about prestigious public interest fellowships, chairs, and career awards for those pursuing science in the public interest, for those who commit to not taking industry money to do their research. And they would then be, a priori, stronger candidates for government funding. Now, this is not a completely novel idea. Law schools have for years been funding public interest fellowships, which are highly prestigious, highly competitive, and come with an obligation on the part of that law students to do public interest law, not to go and work for a big commercial enterprise. So institutions can individually create these structural incentives, indicia of reputation and quality, highly competitive fellowships, chairs, and career awards. As can national funding bodies too, in order to promote this kind of research. And one can also have regulatory reform. That's a larger question. I'll leave that to Q&A. But let me come back to this question of public funding streams, lest I sound naive. So I believe that academic administrators can speak up and should speak up. And I might feel that that was perhaps an unreasonable request were it not for the fact that they have already done so. In April 2011, 100 and something university presidents, including our own university president at the time, sent this letter to the Secretary of Commerce, in which they said, among other things, "We call upon the federal government to refrain from enacting policies such as overly stringent regulations on conflict of interest that discourage our faculty from working with industry or developing innovative technologies. Don't muck up our relationships with industry," was the message loud and clear. These 100 and something university presidents could equally have gotten together and written the following letter. Dear President, dear Secretary of Commerce, dear whoever, you are relying on us, academic research institutions, to solve the nation and the country's serious problems, the wicked problems I referred to before. If you make us dependent on industry to do so, we will only be able to look in places that are consistent with the interests of industry. And that means there are other places we aren't looking, other solutions we aren't exploring. Please, please help us address those problems. Please allow us to look more broadly for solutions. Thank you. So I was asked, what are the mechanisms for the framing effects? So the framing effects, that's a complex question, because in part you might say it's a consequence of the political economy in which we live in some cases. A long history of relationships between the academy and government. But let me just highlight one of the mechanisms, I think. So Don and Chris, the postdoc I mentioned, and I have a paper where we look at the role that industry plays in shaping obesity policy. And it works in a number of different ways, depending which country you look at. But let me sort of describe a couple of examples so you get a sense of it. So in the United Kingdom, the Cameron government, the coalition government, decided that the way to deal with a number of public health problems, among them obesity, was to, instead of entering into an antagonistic relationship with industry, they thought, was to find a way of collaborating with industry. You'll see this on the Partnership for Healthy America in the US too. I think there's a quotation from, I can't remember whether it's Michelle Obama or somebody else. The quotation is something along the lines of, we have no intention of asking things of industry that they can't deliver. Or, you know, in other words, what they're basically saying is, we're going to work with industry. So what happened in the UK was, and this is a great example of something taken off the table that shouldn't have been taken off the table, you had these voluntary pledges. There were these responsibility deal networks that were set up. That was the name, responsibility deal networks. One was for exercise. One was for diet. The exercise one was chaired by the Gym and Fitness Center Trade Association of the UK. So that's not an organization that would be heavily invested in building public spaces and parks to get our children exercising more. One of the committees was chaired by Walker's Crisp, which was a bit like Frito-Lay, or the sort of European equivalent. Another was chaired by one of the big soda companies. And they came up with voluntary pledges. And then other industry partners sign up for those voluntary pledges. And what's interesting is what was put off the table as a result of that relationship. So when the Minister for Health, when he announced the Responsibility Deal Network, said everything is up for grabs here. The only thing we can't do is price. We can't do anything on price. Now, there's a reason why they can't do anything on price. Because these are consensual arrangements, right? Because the problem has been framed and the solution has been framed as one of consensual agreement. Companies can't get together and agree to make food more expensive if it has high fructose, if it has high sugar or high fat or high salt. And the reason they can't do that is because it's anti-competitive. But there's nothing in European competition law that prevents the legislature from saying there should be a soda tax or whatever tax it is. So the very nature of those relationships put certain things off the table. And what you start to see is, again in the UK, the government gave, I can't remember, it was in low digits, single figures in millions of dollars to support research building on the work of Sir Michael Marmot. And Marmot is the man who writes about and does research into the social and environmental influences on health and in particular obesity. But the whole shift of the British government's work, the whole focus in every other way was to build on the approach of Christakis at Harvard. And if you know Christakis' work, his work emphasizes us as individuals and our interactions with others. If you've seen the 2-minute video that accompanies his latest book, it has these stick figures that look like the symbols of men and women on bathroom doors, restroom doors. And then along comes a blob representing an obese person. And when the obese person moves alongside the ordinary stick figure, that stick figure becomes obese. And then when that stick figure moves alongside, that obese figure moves alongside somebody else who's a stick figure, that figure becomes obese. So it sort of suggests that, you know, the last thing we should do is sit down beside somebody who's obese because that's going to make us obese, rather than an entirely different perception of that relationship, which is the reason why both people may be obese is because they both live in the same environment, right? It's a food desert where they don't have access to a supermarket, or they couldn't afford the fresh fruit if they went, and they have 3 jobs, and they live in, you know, Cleveland, for example, has the highest disparity in postcode average lifespan. In one part of Cleveland, it's 63, in the other part, it's 90. So they live in the zip code where the average lifespan is 63, right? Because there are structural factors, environmental factors at play there. So I think, this is not the only example, I'm just giving you Britain as an example, but that's a way in which that problem has been framed in an industry-favorable way. The United Nations Standing Committee on Nutrition in 2006 and 2007 came up with some guidelines for its interactions with industry. And the things that it put off the table in the discussion of partnerships with industry was money or goods and services, any in-kind contribution. So what it wanted to do was maintain the dialogue, but take out the funding. The United Nations, I should say, has more recently taken a much, sorry, the World Health Organization, I'm sorry, the World Health Organization, I should say, more recently has taken a much more partnership-friendly approach to industry. And what's interesting is the UN Secretary General produced a report in August, which was discussed in the General Assembly, I think, a couple of weeks ago. And it talks about the United Nations brand. The United Nations brand. So in the context of public-private partnerships, it has, brand is the language we ordinarily use for products in industry. What matters is not the United Nations brand. It's the United Nations reputation. It's its trust and standing. It's its integrity. It's its consistency with its mission. So I think, the paradigm has become partnership with industry when we need to think more carefully about ways in which the missions of the institutions diverge, right? It's very easy to say, here are the shared values. In fact, if you look at the text on the website describing GE as our corporate partner this year, you'll see a reference to shared values. Some things are shared, but many things are not. Those divergences of interest, divergence in mission, those are really important. So I'm not saying there can be no industry academy interactions. I'm saying we need to rethink the default. And we need to also recognize that those interactions are adjusting and altering our priorities and interfering with our mission. And that, for me, is the important first step. So let me say a little bit about reciprocity. Well, first of all, your point is, yes, I do think we need to act. I hope it should come across that I don't think thinking more carefully is it. I think we need to act. But I will say something about thinking more carefully, just to expand it.
I'm all for thinking more carefully.
So I wrote a little blog post to go along with my public partnerships paper, in which I presented a hypothetical, but it's not a hypothetical. It's a problem that public health officials face in inner cities across America every day. They have no playgrounds for their children, right? The city's children. What do you do when a food company comes up to you and says, we'll give you $100,000 for a playground. All you have to do is put up this plaque and stand and shake hands with the director of our company and the CEO of the charitable foundation that we created in order to channel the gift. And part of what I think I've been trying to do is to give those public health officials a language to understand and express what's problematic about that interaction and hopefully to act accordingly. But they're the ones who have to decide how they act. That's their business, not mine. But yes, as far as the academy is concerned, I think we in the academy have certain things we can do, and I think one of them is the one I indicated. But reciprocity, let me say something about reciprocity. I happen to know you. If I give you my paper and ask you for comments and you respond within 24 hours, but when you send me your paper, I sit in it for 6 months and you continually chase me, there has been a failure of reciprocity. You are utterly entitled to be dissatisfied with and disappointed in me, right? In that relationship, reciprocity makes sense. We do have a mutuality of interest. Reciprocity is what we look for in our friends, in our partners. But reciprocity between two entities who have divergent missions, especially when one of those entities has as part of its mission something to do with the public interest or the public good, is problematic. And so for me, reciprocity between the academy and industry is one of the problems we haven't fully addressed, right? I can give you money with no strings attached. But then we have what some people call the tyranny of the next gift, right? Even if I don't feel reciprocal obligations in the last thing you gave me, which I am very likely to feel, the possibility of the next gift can have a chilling effect on the way we behave. So I do greatly worry about reciprocity between industry and the academy. And I'm just going to give you one example from a different piece in the New York Times. A piece by Peggy Orenstein, who is a survivor of breast cancer, but became slightly troubled by, I think, having read Pink Ribbons, Inc. and other things. And she said, what we've really pushed in the context of breast cancer, and by the way, prioritize breast cancer is important, but there's cervical cancer, there are other cancers that are important too. But what she's really saying is, this is the way we've dealt with breast cancer. We use these 5-year survival rates, and we've emphasized early diagnosis. So you take a group of women and you diagnose them early at 67, you give them really aggressive therapy, and they die 7 years later. Well, they have a 100% survival rate after 5 years, right? But if you had left them till later and not treated them at all, they might all have died at the same stage, but now the survival rate goes down to 0, right? And so what she is saying is that what we've considered to be success in breast cancer may just be a result of pushing early diagnosis and aggressive therapy, even though lifespan and quality of life may not have been improved as a result. So, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. The way what gets construed as a problem, and which problems get prioritized, are all part of the picture too. So that's great. I just want to, two things immediately come to mind when you talk about the WHO. As somebody pointed out a couple of years ago, the WHO's entire budget, biennial budget, is dwarfed by the combined marketing budget of Coke and Pepsi for its main products. So, you know, when we think about what the WHO can do, it's an incredibly under-resourced organization on its own. And so you can understand why it wants to dance with industry, right? Because it thinks it can get more done. And I very much agree with your concerns. About the, you know, the health problems of the developing world that we so terribly neglect, there are some who have tried to come up with practical proposals to address that. One I just want to flag for people who are interested is the philosopher Thomas Pogge, who argued that basically what we should do is we should set up a prize fund. And the idea is if a drug company can, instead of patenting drugs, if the drug company can demonstrate that it has had an impact on the health and quality of life in people in a particular area, it gets reimbursed from the fund on that basis. So now there's an incentive to develop drugs for populations that can't afford them, whereas right now there isn't really a structural incentive to do that. So yes, I think that's an important problem. I just want to say one other thing, because it just occurred to me, the gentleman here who asked me a question before about industry-academy interactions. And I'm just going to mention this because it arose at the seminar at lunch today. We were talking about public-private partnerships and related to food and health, and also more broadly. If you want an article on how to formulate a public-private partnership, I can point you in the direction of half a dozen articles that all make claims about a principled way to enter into public-private partnerships. Partnerships involving the government and industry, the academy and industry, or various combinations thereof. Plenty of them. I see my role as somewhat different. I see my role as pointing out some of the systemic problems. So for example, when somebody says to me, show me an ideal public-private partnership we can model our partnership on, I say, no, I'm not going to do that. And the reason why I'm not going to do that is because your focus on a single public-private partnership neglects the systemic effects. And it's not a radical notion that one should pay attention to the systemic effects. There's a whole body of law that does just this, and I alluded to it briefly a moment ago. What you call antitrust law, what we call antitrust law in the US, what we call competition law in the UK. You've probably heard about the merger of two airlines right now, right, which the Department of Justice recently reached a settlement regarding. That's because what you're concerned about in antitrust or competition law is webs of relationship. Right? I may enter into an agreement with you which is unproblematic, but it's not unproblematic if it has, combined with all sorts of other arrangements I've made with other people and that you've made with other people and that they've made with other people, has an effect that is anti-competitive in the marketplace. Right? And in fact, we make it unlawful under European and American antitrust law to enter such webs of arrangements. I'm not arguing that we should make academy-industry relations necessarily unlawful in the same way. I'm just saying that we need to start thinking about the systemic effects and stop pretending that things in isolation are unproblematic. Because if we do that, I think we're neglecting the real issue. The question was, If you take industry out of research, there'll be less research done. What do we do about that? So the money blinds proposal that I put up on the slide is intended to preserve the industry funding, right? And to separate off the negative effects. So that's trying to have your cake and eat it. My argument about the trying to have your cake and eat it is even if you can get that to work, right? Even if you can get that to work, even if you want to preserve industry funding in that way, we are deluding ourselves, right? Just as you would accuse me of deluding myself to say government money will appear magically to replace industry money, we are also deluding ourselves. We are engaged in mass delusion that we are looking fully and broadly at the solutions to important social problems, right? With the system we currently have. So there are different kinds of delusion. And what I would say is, I take your point. If you take out industry money, where's the rest going to come from? What I would say is you could initiate the money blind solution, but you shouldn't pretend that's a solution completely, because that way you still preserve industry funding, you make it less problematic, but you don't address the problem that I'm highlighting, which is looking in areas that are not in the interest of industry. And the only way you're going to address that is if we collectively, as institutions, stand up and honestly say so together, that this is a problem. And I can't tell you what will come of that process, but why on earth aren't we trying?
Please join me